Okay, we're going to say a few brief words about the Thomas Hobbes chapter, going over certain key points in the reading. So the reading begins with a discussion of the two basic kinds of motions. Hobbes refers to them as the vital and the animal. Now, vital motions have to do with those physiological processes of which we are scarcely aware, such as the circulation of the blood, our breathing, pulse rate, the growth of your hair and nails and that sort of thing. And Hobbes doesn't consider those kinds of motions important for his project. He's more concerned with the animal or the voluntary motions, which have to do with walking, speaking, striking, moving, right, as opposed to what is going on inside of our bodies. He's concerned with voluntary motions. And these voluntary motions, he says, they have their beginnings in the imagination, or what he calls endeavor. And there are two types of endeavor. He calls them appetite or desire, and then aversion. So appetite or desire impels us to move towards an object that we find pleasing, that gives us pleasure or promises to give us pleasure. Aversion, on the other hand, would be the opposite, would be a repulsion from or a movement away from an object or a situation that could cause us pain. So all of our voluntary motions are the result of one or the other of these two types of endeavor. In other words, all of our voluntary motions, all of our actions stem either from desire or from aversion. Now for Hobbes, when we say that we love something, what we really mean is that the objects that we say that we love are pleasant to us, and the objects that we say that we hate are painful to us. So essentially Hobbes is a hedonist. Right? Hedonism is the view that good and the pleasant are identical, and evil and pain are identical. So when we use the terms good and evil, according to Hobbes, we're simply expressing either our desire for something or our aversion to something. So whatever we have a desire for, which is another way of saying whatever gives us pleasure, we call that good. Whatever we have an aversion to, which is to say whatever gives us pain, we call evil. So good and evil are relative to the individual. They're relative to our own subjective preferences for what we find pleasant and what we find painful or unpleasant. Hobbes says this explicitly in the reading. He says that there is nothing simply and absolutely good or evil, nor any common rule or standard of good and evil to be taken from the nature of the objects themselves. For example, a good friend of mine hates pineapple juice. He is completely disgusted by pineapple juice. He finds it gross. It makes him nauseous. The tartness of it really repulses him, and therefore, according to Hobbes, he would call pineapple juice evil, something to be avoided. I, on the other hand, I happen to like pineapple juice. I think it tastes great. So to me, according to Hobbes, I would have to call it good, and I would gravitate towards it. I'll drink it whenever I have an occasion to do so, whereas my friend would have an aversion to it because it disgusts him, and he would avoid it at all costs. So there's nothing, according to Hobbes, intrinsically good or evil about pineapple juice. It is good in my view because it brings me pleasure, whereas it is evil in my friend's view because it brings him pain or disgust. So for Hobbes, then, good and evil, the terms good and evil are relative to individual tastes, preferences, and so forth. Now let's switch gears for a moment and talk about the sources of violent conflict, according to Hobbes. He identifies three main causes of human conflict. The first is competition for scarce goods. like food, for example. So in the state of nature, which we will discuss in a moment, there is not abundance of goods. There is a scarcity of goods. So you have people having to fight for survival. There's not enough food to feed everyone. So therefore, people have to be ready to kill their rivals in order to secure the necessities for living. The second principal cause of conflict is diffidence. And diffidence refers to that feeling of insecurity that we have when we are surrounded by individuals who are at least as strong and powerful as we are. Diffidence often impels us to strike first in order to gain an advantage over a potential adversary. It is the sense of insecurity and vulnerability that leads us to kill to prevent ourselves from being killed. And thirdly, glory, or the quest for fame and honor, is a cause of human conflict. And this is similar to number one because glory is a scarce good. Not everyone can be number one. Not everyone can be Caesar or Alexander or King Leonidas and so forth, or Achilles, right? And therefore, when you have a number of ambitious honor lovers and very few spots at the top of the pyramid, you are going to have violent conflict for that scarce good, which is immortal fame and glory. So these are the three main causes of violent conflict, and Hobbes, in his political philosophy, which leads to the social contract, aims to do away with all of these causes, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, Hobbes argues that outside of a civil society, outside of a human community governed by laws and by punishments, by a strong and authoritarian ruler, outside of that political context, you have what he calls the state of nature, where it is basically anarchy. There is scarcity, violence, ghastly death. There is no justice, there is no law, there is no order, there is nothing but a war of every man against every man. Every man is an enemy to every man. There is no peace, there is no harmony, there is no cooperation, there is no mutual goodwill. So in this state of nature, as Hobbes calls it, all of the benefits of civilized life are non-existent. Just think for a moment about all of the things that civilization brings us. Engineering, commerce, the sciences, philosophy, literature, the arts, technology, modern medicine, air conditioning, manners, morals, politeness, decency, religion, right? None of these things exist in the state of nature. It is basically a jungle law scenario where human beings are living like animals. There is no agriculture. He mentions there's a famous passage in the reading. There's no architecture, no labor-saving devices, no washing machines, no tractors, no cranes, no knowledge of the earth. There are no clocks. There's no accounting of time. Like animals, people live in a perpetual present in the state of nature. And this is the most famous passage in Hobbes. He says, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Again, to put it bluntly, Hobbes's vision of the state of nature is a hellish place, a place fit for brutish animals. Now, Hobbes contrasts the state of nature with what he calls the commonwealth, or the community or society that is built around the social contract. Human beings decide to enter the commonwealth, to come together and live in a community of their fellow human beings, not out of a feeling of goodwill towards their fellow human beings, not out of sense of brotherhood or fraternity, but rather out of a mutual fear that they have of one another, a fear consisting partly in the natural equality of men, partly in their mutual will of hurting. For Hobbes, human beings are essentially equal. We're basically equal in intelligence and in physical strength. There are no vast disparities in these two areas among human beings. Now, some people may be a little bit smarter than others, more cunning than others, but they're also more physically imposing than others. That it all balances out. So, a puny guy who's cunning and smart can still contend with a brawny guy who's not very intelligent. Right? The puny guy can use his intelligence to kill the brawny guy. He could poison him. He could kill him in his sleep. He could find ingenious ways of killing a rival, right? So all of these qualities balance each other out, according to Hobbes, and we're basically equal. What really makes us equal for Hobbes is that we have an equal ability to kill one another and to be killed by one another. Okay, so according to Hobbes, our reason, our intelligence, gives us an important insight, what he calls the law of nature, which tells us that we have an obligation to seek the peace and follow it. Or to put it another way, we have an obligation to do whatever it takes for us to preserve our lives. We have an obligation to do whatever it takes to protect ourselves from injury and especially from death. Why is death such a terrible thing? Well, for Hobbes, it is the worst thing that can happen to us. Violent death. It is the worst thing. Now, Hobbes is a materialist. So he basically believes that human beings are made up of matter, and he never talks about the soul. The word soul does not appear in the reading. So he appears to be of the view that we are just bodies. And if we are just bodies, then this is all we have. This life is all we have. And therefore, we have to do whatever we can to protect this life. And the worst thing that can happen to us is to have this life taken away from us. Therefore, death, in particular violent death, because it's painful, is the greatest of evils for Hobbes. And therefore, we must do whatever we can to avoid violent death. But it's more than just that. We also have a desire to enjoy pleasure, to live comfortably. Remember, Hobbes is a hedonist. Evil is pain and good is pleasure. So not only do we want to fend off violent death, but we want to live comfortably. We want to enjoy pleasure. And you cannot have the good life, so to speak, according to Hobbes. You can't have a comfortable living in the state of nature. Because comfortable living requires security, it requires order. You can't have that in the state of nature, only in civilized life. And it requires the arts and the sciences and technology in order to create the tools and the luxuries that make comfortable living possible, right? You can't have air conditioning and comfortable furniture and modern medicine without science and technology. And you cannot have science and technology outside of a civilized society that has the institutions of higher learning, for example, that make technology possible. So the two passions of fear of violent death and the desire for pleasure are what, according to Hobbes, lead us to discover the law of nature, which tells us to leave the state of nature and to enter into civil society and to give up our right the right that we have in the state of nature, which is to kill anyone, give up that right and agree to obey the laws. As he says, this is the social contract pledge, that a man be willing, when others are so too, for the sake of peace, to lay down this right to all things. In the state of nature, remember, we have a right to everything, which is almost like saying we have a right to nothing. And be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. So we have to divest ourselves mutually of our right to harm each other when we enter into civil society. So it amounts to the saying that your right to punch me ends where my nose begins, and my right to punch you ends where your nose begins. So it's basically a pledge to refrain from harming one another. Okay, so our agreements, our contracts, our promises, our pledges to one another are valuable only insofar as we abide by them. And this is where Hobbes shows that he is a conventionalist, that justice, this is the view that justice is a matter of human agreement. It has no meaning or substance outside of a human agreement. This is the exact same as Epicurus. You might remember, Epicurus is also a hedonist. So, according to Hobbes, when a covenant is made, a covenant is a promise, right, or an agreement. To break it is unjust. And the definition of injustice is no other than the not performance of covenant. And whatsoever is not unjust is just. Now, to put it another way, justice is obeying the law or the covenant. Injustice is disobeying the law or the covenant. And that is it. That is the essence of justice and injustice. It is basically obeying the man-made laws of the Commonwealth. There is nothing beyond that. There is no standard of the just that transcends the man-made law of the Commonwealth. But Hobbes, if you remember from this state of nature argument, it's a war of every man against every man, which implies that human beings are selfish, greedy, exploitative, and violent. And therefore, if that is our true nature, then in order to get us to obey the laws, we need an incentive to do so. And for Hobbes, that incentive is some coercive power that can compel men equally to the performance of their covenants by the terror of some punishment greater than the benefit they expect by the breach of their covenant. In other words, it is through the threat of punishment, a severe punishment, that human beings will obey the laws. Human beings are not naturally good, in other words. They're not naturally virtuous. They need to be made afraid of the possibility of getting caught and punished. So you need the stick more than the carrot to bring people in line. So Hobbes says that human nature is so dark and violent and egoistic that you need a brutal authoritarian ruler, or one might even use the word dictator, in order to keep human beings in line. This is a very severe, harsh view of human nature. One may agree or disagree with it, but that's certainly Hobbes's view. Now, this coercive power is the civil government or the Commonwealth. Let's continue with this line of reasoning. Hobbes has an interesting version of the golden rule. Remember, in Christ's golden rule from the Gospels, it promotes charity, it promotes doing good, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? That's a positive rule. Hobbes's golden rule is negative. He says, do not that to another which thou would not have done to thyself. So Hobbes's golden rule does not promote charity. All it does is admonish people to avoid inflicting harm on others because one does not want that harm visited on oneself and revenge. So Hobbes' golden rule is egoistic. It is self-serving, self-regarding. And this is a very modern understanding, right? You hear it in little sayings such as, honesty is the best policy, right? If you're honest, less bad stuff will happen to you. You shouldn't be honest. It's not saying that you should be honest because it's intrinsically good to be honest. The saying implies that it's good to be honest because it benefits you to be honest. Or if you've ever seen a billboard or a traffic sign that says, stop at the red light because the life you save may be your own, that is essentially a version of Hobbes' golden rule, because it's saying the reason why you should stop at the red light is not because you might end up T-boning a minivan with a bunch of kids coming home from a baseball game. That's not the reason why. The reason why is that you might put your own life at risk if you run that red light. Somebody might T-bone you. And that's the reason why you should obey the traffic laws and stop on red. So it's a very self-serving, egoistic, selfish way of looking at these things. But Hobbes believes that since we are deep down selfish beings, that the best way to get people to obey the rules is to appeal to that selfishness rather than appealing to some illusory love of mankind, which is what Hobbes would say that Christ is doing. So it depends on how you understand human nature. Are we essentially egoistic and exploitative, as Hobbes says, or are we different? Are we innately good? Or are we capable of becoming good? That's a fundamental question about human nature, which is something that we need to ask ourselves. Okay, when Hobbes talks about the Commonwealth and towards the end of the reading, he talks about the different powers that the Commonwealth must have in order to function properly, in order to achieve the goal of comfortable self-preservation. That is the overriding goal of government and of civil society for Hobbes. It is to create the conditions for peace, law, and order on the one hand, by restraining men's passions, by keeping human beings from hurting or killing one another, and then in addition, creating the conditions for the flourishing of science and technology and commerce, which will give rise to the comfortable, commodious living aspect of Hobbes's political philosophy. So it's stability, safety, law and order, plus pleasure, plus comfort. That is the recipe for the good life that we get from Hobbes. And in order to make that possible, the Commonwealth, the government, has to have certain powers. And I'm not going to talk about all of the powers, but just about one or two that I think are the most interesting. He mentions censorship as a necessary function of the government, right? The government must have the power to censor ideas and opinions that are coming out of books and speeches and so forth. And that's very un-American, we might say, because in this country, we believe in the First Amendment, right to free speech, right? We also believe in the right to free inquiry, right? There should be no censorship in a free society. Of course, Hobbes' Commonwealth is not a free society. Now, what kind of rationale, what kind of reasoning could one give to defend this proposition that censorship is necessary? Well, this is what he says. He says, the actions of men proceed from their opinions, and in the well-governing of opinions consists the well-governing of men's actions in order to their peace and concord. So what Hobbes is saying is that people act on the basis of a certain opinions about what is proper, about what is right. And if you want to govern or control people's actions, it's not really enough to have a policeman on every corner watching you. If you really want to control how people live, how they act, you need to control their opinions. their worldviews. And that's how you get people to live peacefully and to live in concord. Concord means likeness of mind, sharing the same values and opinions about the good and the bad, and just and the unjust, and so forth. Whereas in the state of nature, good and evil are simply personal opinions based on what pleases and displeases us. In the Commonwealth, that gets reversed. Hobbes says that everyone has to be taught that good and evil are what the government say they are, because you need to have uniformity of belief and opinion. If you have different opinions that are clashing, that are inconsistent with one another, you're going to have conflict. And that brings us to this slide here about the seditious doctrine of relativism, essentially. One of the most dangerous opinions a society can have, according to Hobbes, is the opinion that every man is the judge of good and evil actions. Now, that's a very common view today. The relativism is very common in the 21st century in the Western world. You hear people saying all the time, and I hear my students saying all the time, who's to say what's right and wrong? Who am I to tell you how to live your life? Who are you to tell me how to live my life? Right? Who's to say what's good or bad? Who's to say that polygamy is a bad thing? Who's to say that bin Laden is a terrorist and not a freedom fighter? And so forth. And Hobbes is saying that's a very, very dangerous point of view. And any government, any society that wants to preserve itself and to remain stable and orderly cannot allow this opinion to flourish. He says, from this false doctrine, men are disposed to debate with themselves and dispute the commands of the Commonwealth, and afterwards to obey or disobey them as in their private judgments they shall think fit, whereby the Commonwealth is distracted and weakened. So that's the problem with relativism, with giving people the freedom to decide what good and evil are for themselves. When you do this, you will cause the whole society to implode, because people will start questioning the laws, start questioning the authority of the ruler, start questioning the shared values and opinions that keep the society intact. And you will see the foundations begin to crumble. And then we end up eventually in the state of nature again. This also holds true for freedom of conscience, which is a freedom that we in the United States, at least, hold very dear. You cannot allow people, Hobbes says, to follow their consciences, because that will often conflict with what the civil laws dictate. And the civil laws for Hobbes comprise the conscience of the people. So you are supposed to align your conscience with what the civil laws tell you to do. So there is no Socrates in this kind of societies. You don't have philosophers who question and look for weaknesses in what the laws say are just and so forth. You don't have that. There's no room for philosophy in Hobbes's Commonwealth. You are a subject. You must obey. The virtue of Hobbes's subjects in the Commonwealth is obedience. Obedience. You do what you're told. If you want law and order, if you want peace, if you want stability, you need obedience. All right, well, that concludes our small, short lecture on Hobbes. Thank you for listening.